They called her Sparkler behind her back, not because Irene Hill was brilliant at demolitions, but because they thought her attempts were as harmless as fireworks at a children's party. At 23 years old, standing barely 5 feet 3 inches tall, with hands they said were too delicate for real explosives work, she was the joke of the 3rd Combat Engineer Battalion. But on a dusty morning in Kosovo, when a reinforced concrete barrier stood between 12 trapped civilians and certain death, those same engineers would watch in stunned silence as this young woman from rural Austria did something they'd sworn was impossible. This is the story of how Irene Hill turned 90 seconds into a lifetime of respect. Before we continue, let us know where you're watching from. If you're enjoying this, don't miss out. Subscribe now for more. The sun hung low over Camp Sentinel, casting long shadows across the dusty training ground where the 3rd Combat Engineer Battalion conducted their morning drills. Irene Hill stood at the edge of the blast zone, her safety goggles slightly too large for her face, slipping down her nose as she studied the practice wall before her. The wall was standard training fare, reinforced concrete 18 inches thick, designed to simulate the kind of barriers combat engineers encountered in urban warfare. Around her, the other engineers were placing their charges with practiced efficiency, their movements confident and precise. Irene's hands, however, moved with a different kind of precision, careful, calculated, almost surgical. "Hey, Sparkler," called out Lieutenant Davies, his voice carrying across the training ground with casual cruelty. "You planning to breach that wall, or just admire it all morning?" Laughter rippled through the assembled engineers. The nickname had stuck within her first week at Camp Sentinel, coined after her initial demolitions assessment when her carefully placed charges had produced what Davies called more sparkle than substance. Never mind that the wall had come down exactly as planned. What mattered to them was that it had taken her twice as long to set up the charges, and her approach had been unconventional. Irene didn't respond to Davies. She'd learned in her 6 months at Camp Sentinel that defending herself only invited more mockery. Instead, she continued her work, her fingers moving along the concrete surface, feeling for density variations, mapping the internal structure through touch and calculation rather than the brute force approach favored by her peers. She'd grown up in a small Austrian village where her father had worked in mining demolitions. While other girls her age were learning to bake or sew, Irene had been studying blast patterns and compression waves. Her father had taught her that explosives weren't about power. They were about precision, understanding how materials failed, where stress concentrated, how energy transferred through different mediums. It was science, not brute force. But the military didn't seem to value that kind of knowledge. Here, combat engineering was dominated by former infantry soldiers who'd transferred into the role, men who approached demolitions with the same mindset they'd brought to everything else, overwhelming force and aggressive confidence. They set their charges heavy, used more explosives than necessary, and called it being thorough. Irene's approach, minimal explosives, maximum efficiency, was viewed as timid, feminine, insufficient. The fact that her breaches worked perfectly didn't matter. What mattered was that she didn't fit their image of what a combat engineer should be. 30 seconds, Hill," Davies called out. "We haven't got all day." Irene placed her final charge, a small-shaped explosive, positioned at a precise angle that the others would have dismissed as inadequate. She backed away from the wall, checking her detonator connections one final time. Around her, the other engineers had already completed their setups, their charges visible as heavy clusters of explosives arranged in the standard military pattern. Hit it hard, hit it everywhere, make sure it comes down. Her setup looked sparse by comparison. 4 small charges placed at seemingly random points on the wall's surface. She could hear the whispered comments from the other engineers, could feel their judgment like a physical weight. "Command has cleared the range," Davies announced. "First up, Sergeant Kowalski, show us how it's done." Kowalski was everything Irene wasn't. 6 feet tall, built like the concrete walls he demolished, with a reputation for spectacular breaches. His charges were set in the classic pattern, enough explosive to bring down a wall twice the size of their practice barrier. The detonation was thunderous, a wall of sound and pressure that made even the experienced engineers step back. When the smoke cleared, the wall was gone, reduced to rubble scattered across 50 feet of range. The engineers cheered and clapped Kowalski on the back. "That's how you do it," Davies shouted over the ringing in everyone's ears. "Clean, simple, effective, no fancy calculations needed, just good solid engineering." 3 more engineers went, each producing similarly spectacular results. Massive detonations, walls reduced to rubble, displays of raw power that left no doubt about their effectiveness. By the time it was Irene's turn, the mood was almost festive. The engineers looking forward to the inevitable anticlimax of watching Sparkler work her magic. Irene approached the firing line, her detonator feeling suddenly heavy in her small hands. She knew what they expected: a weak attempt, insufficient power, probably a wall left partially standing that would require a second charge to finish the job. She'd seen the looks they exchanged when her name was called, the barely suppressed smiles. "Whenever you're ready, Hill," Davies said, his tone making it clear he expected failure. "Though, maybe you want to add a few more charges first. That setup looks a bit minimal." "It's sufficient, sir," Irene replied quietly, her accented English carrying a certainty that made Davies frown. "Your call. But when that wall's still standing, you'll be out here all afternoon, resetting charges." Irene didn't argue. She'd learned that her work spoke louder than her words ever could. She checked her connections one final time, confirmed the range was clear, and pressed the detonator. The explosion was different from the others, sharper, more focused, almost surgical in its precision. There was less smoke, less flying debris, less of everything that the other engineers associated with a successful breach. For a moment, as the dust began to settle, Irene could see the smirks forming on their faces. Another Sparkler special. Insufficient power, wall still standing. Then the wall moved. Not collapsed, not exploded, moved. The entire 18-inch barrier shifted backward as a single piece, then folded in on itself with geometric precision. The concrete didn't shatter into random rubble, but broke along carefully calculated failure lines, falling inward in a controlled collapse that left the edges clean and the surrounding area untouched. Within 5 seconds of detonation, where there had been a solid wall, there was now a perfect breach, wide enough for vehicle passage, clean enough for safe foot traffic, with minimal debris field and no structural compromise to the surrounding practice barriers. The training ground fell silent. Irene lowered her detonator and waited for the inevitable criticism. They'd find something wrong. Too slow, too complicated. Not enough show of force. They always did. Instead, Davies walked slowly toward the breached wall, his expression unreadable. The other engineers followed, clustering around the opening that Irene had created, with a fraction of the explosives they'd used. She could see them examining the clean edges, the controlled failure pattern, the minimal collateral damage. "Hill," Davies finally said, his voice carrying none of its usual mockery, "what the hell did you just do?" What Irene had done was demonstrate a demolitions technique that most combat engineers considered theoretical: precision structural failure using minimal explosive force. While the others had obliterated their walls through overwhelming power, she'd analyzed the concrete's internal structure and placed shaped charges at exact points where the material's compressive strength was naturally weakest. "I calculated the stress points, sir," Irene explained, approaching the breach while the other engineers continued their examination. "Concrete has natural failure planes based on how it was poured and cured. If you identify those planes and apply force at the right angles, you can control exactly how the structure fails." "That's not how we do things here, Hill," Davies said, though his tone had lost its dismissive edge. "We use proven methods, standard approaches that work every time. With respect, sir, this also works. It uses 60% less explosives, produces minimal debris, and creates a cleaner breach point." Irene gestured toward the opening. "In a real operation, that means less risk to nearby friendly forces, less chance of collateral damage, and faster breach entry." Sergeant Kowalski, who'd been examining the edge of Irene's breach, spoke up. "She's not wrong about the clean edges. My breach scattered concrete fragments across half the range. This one, you could drive a vehicle through without worrying about tire damage." "Sure," If you've got an hour to do calculations and mapping before every breach, another engineer interjected. In combat, we need speed, not math problems. This was the criticism Irene had heard repeatedly since joining the battalion. Her methods worked, but took longer to set up. In the field, speed often mattered more than efficiency. A fast, messy breach was better than a slow, perfect one. How long did your setup take? Davies asked, checking his stopwatch log. 11 minutes from approach to ready to detonate. Kowalski did his in 5. Yes, sir, Irene acknowledged. But in a real scenario, with civilians nearby, or structural concerns about adjacent buildings, those extra 6 minutes could prevent casualties or mission compromise. Davies shook his head. This isn't engineering school, Hill. This is combat operations. We don't have time for your theoretical approaches, no matter how pretty they look on paper. The dismissal stung, but Irene had expected it. She'd grown used to having her work acknowledged as technically impressive, but practically useless. The fact that her methods might save lives or prevent collateral damage didn't outweigh the military's preference for proven, aggressive approaches. As the training session concluded and the engineers returned to their quarters, Irene overheard the inevitable post-exercise analysis. The other soldiers gathered in small groups, discussing the day's breaches with the casual camaraderie that never quite extended to include her. I'll give Sparkler credit, Kowalski was saying to a group near the equipment shed. That was a clever breach, but clever doesn't keep you alive when someone's shooting at you. Exactly, agreed Private Morrison, a newer engineer who'd nonetheless absorbed the battalion's culture quickly. Combat engineering isn't about finesse, it's about getting the job done fast and getting out. All her calculations and careful placement, that's just wasted time in a real fight. Plus, added another voice Irene didn't recognize, can you imagine her trying to haul breach equipment under fire? She can barely carry a full demo pack without struggling. Precision doesn't matter if you can't get to the target in the first place. Irene kept walking, her jaw tight. She'd heard variations of this conversation dozens of times. Too small, too slow, too theoretical. Never mind that she'd pass at every physical requirement, that her demo pack was always perfectly organized to minimize weight, that her careful planning had never failed to achieve mission objectives in training exercises. What mattered to the battalion was that she didn't fit their image of a combat engineer. She didn't have the aggressive confidence, the physical intimidation, the willingness to rely on overwhelming force. In their eyes, she was a liability waiting to happen. Someone who might produce interesting results in controlled training, but would fold under real pressure. Back in her quarters, Irene pulled out her personal notebook. A battered journal filled with calculations, diagrams, and structural analysis that she'd been compiling since her first day at Camp Sentinel. Every building on the base was mapped in detail, every potential breach point analyzed, every structural weakness documented. It was obsessive, she knew that, but it was also who she was. While the other engineers spent their evenings in the rec room or catching up on sleep, Irene studied. She analyzed blast patterns from historical operations, read engineering journals about structural failure mechanics, practiced her calculations until she could map a building's weak points by sight alone. Nobody had asked her to do this extra work. Nobody appreciated the depth of knowledge she was building. But Irene had learned from her father that expertise was built in the hours nobody else wanted to invest. When opportunity came, and she believed it would come, she'd be ready. 3 weeks passed with little change in the battalion's routine, or in Irene's position within it. She continued to excel in technical evaluations, continued to be overlooked for significant assignments, continued to be Sparkler, the engineer they tolerated but didn't trust. Then came the morning briefing that would change everything. Major Henderson stood at the front of the assembly hall, his expression grave as he addressed the gathered combat engineers. Behind him, a satellite image showed an urban area that Irene immediately recognized as Pristina, the capital of Kosovo, where tensions had been escalating for weeks. "Listen up," Henderson began, his voice cutting through the usual pre-briefing chatter. We've got a situation developing in Sector 12. Local ethnic tensions have boiled over into active conflict. There's a group of civilians, 12 people including 4 children, trapped in a residential building that's now caught between hostile forces. The satellite image zoomed in, showing a 3-story structure surrounded by what appeared to be makeshift barricades and fortified positions. Henderson continued, his tone growing more urgent. The civilians are in the basement. Both sides of the conflict have agreed to a temporary ceasefire for evacuation, but there's a problem. He pointed to a thick line visible even in the satellite imagery. Someone erected a reinforced concrete wall, blocking the basement's only accessible exit. We don't know if it was defensive or tactical, but it's now preventing extraction. Irene leaned forward, studying the image with intense focus. The wall looked substantial, easily 2 feet thick, based on the shadow patterns, probably reinforced with rebar given the strategic location. Our job is to breach that wall and extract those civilians, Henderson continued. But here's the complication. The ceasefire is holding for now, but it's fragile. Both sides have agreed to give us exactly 2 hours to get those people out. After that, they resume fighting, whether we're clear or not. A hand went up from Sergeant Kowalski. Sir, 2 hours should be plenty of time for a standard breach and extraction. Under normal circumstances, yes, Henderson agreed. But the building structure is compromised. Intelligence suggests the upper floors have sustained damage that's left them unstable. A standard breach with heavy explosives risks bringing down the entire building on top of the civilians we're trying to save. The room fell silent as the implications sank in. A standard breach would be quick, but potentially catastrophic. A careful approach might be safer, but could exceed the 2-hour window, leaving everyone trapped when the fighting resumed. We need a precision breach, Henderson stated flatly. Enough force to break through that wall, minimal force to avoid structural collapse. And we need it done fast, once we're on site. Irene's heart began to race. This was exactly the kind of scenario her methods were designed for, a breach requiring surgical precision rather than overwhelming force. She raised her hand before she could talk herself out of it. Yes, Hill, Henderson acknowledged, sounding slightly surprised. Sir, I have experience with precision breaching of reinforced concrete in structurally compromised environments. Irene's voice was steady despite her nervousness. My approach uses minimal explosives placed at calculated stress points to control the failure pattern. It's designed specifically for scenarios where collateral structural damage must be avoided. The room's attention turned toward her, and Irene could feel the weight of skeptical stares. Davies spoke up from his position near the front. Sir, with respect, Hill's methods are theoretically sound but unproven in real combat conditions. This isn't the time for experimental approaches. I agree, Henderson replied, and Irene felt her brief hope deflating. This mission requires proven techniques and experienced personnel. Davies, I want you leading the breach team. Kowalski, you're his second. Morrison, Rodriguez, your backup. Start planning your approach. We move out in 4 hours. As the briefing continued with tactical details, Irene sat back in her chair, the familiar disappointment settling over her like a heavy blanket. Once again, her skills were acknowledged as interesting but insufficient. Once again, the mission would go to engineers who fit the expected mold. But as she studied the satellite image of that reinforced wall blocking 12 civilians from safety, a cold certainty settled in her chest. The standard approach would kill those people. She knew it with the same mathematical certainty she knew structural failure patterns. We've invested considerable effort in bringing you this story. If you find it engaging, please consider subscribing to our channel. Your support is greatly appreciated. Now, let's return to the narrative. The planning session took place in the battalion's tactical room, where Davies and his team gathered around the scaled model of the target building. Irene stood at the back, officially present only to provide technical support if requested. Nobody had requested anything. Standard approach, Davies was saying, pointing to the basement wall on the model. We set charges in a diamond pattern, heavy enough to guarantee breakthrough. The building's already damaged, so we'll work fast and get out before anything shifts. Kowalski frowned at the model. Sir, Henderson specifically said to minimize structural impact, a diamond pattern with charges heavy enough to breach 2 foot Reinforced concrete is going to create serious vibrations. If those upper floors are as unstable as intelligence suggests, then we work faster. Davies interrupted. The civilians are in the basement. Even if the upper floors come down, they'll be protected by the basement ceiling structure. We get them out through the breach before anything collapses. Irene bit her lip, fighting the urge to speak. The plan was flawed. A diamond pattern breach would create compression waves that traveled through the building's foundation. If the upper structure was already compromised, those waves could trigger catastrophic failure faster than the team could evacuate the civilians. What about a precision approach? Morrison asked, surprising everyone. Like what Hill demonstrated at training? Minimal charges, controlled failure. Davies shook his head. Takes too long to set up. We've got a 2-hour window from arrival, and we need to account for unexpected delays. Standard approach is faster, and fast is what keeps everyone alive. But if the building comes down, Morrison started. It won't, Davies said firmly. I've done 50 breaches in urban environments. Trust the experience, not theoretical calculations. We use proven methods. The meeting continued with logistics discussions and equipment assignments. Irene remained silent, watching as they finalized a plan she knew would fail. When Davies dismissed the team to prepare, she approached him quietly. Lieutenant, I've analyzed the satellite imagery. The damage pattern on the upper floors suggests compromised, load-bearing walls on the eastern side. A standard breach will create sympathetic failures that could... Hill! Davies cut her off, his tone not unkind, but dismissive. I appreciate your technical knowledge, but this is a combat operation, not a classroom exercise. The plan is set. Your job is to have backup equipment ready if we need it. Sir, please just look at my calculations. If you place the charges at these specific points instead... Irene pulled out her notebook, pages filled with detailed structural analysis. Davies glanced at the calculations without really seeing them. You did all this in 3 weeks. When did you even get access to the detailed building specs? I requested them from intelligence this morning and worked through lunch, Irene admitted. The building's construction is typical Soviet-era design, with known weaknesses in the column spacing. If we account for those weaknesses... That's enough, Hill. Davies's voice hardened. You're not on this mission. Your job is support, and I need you focused on that, not second-guessing the operational plan. Am I clear? Yes, sir, Irene replied quietly. Crystal clear. She walked away from the planning room, her notebook clutched against her chest. Around her, the battalion was mobilizing for departure, vehicles being loaded, equipment checked, personnel gathering their gear. The energy was focused, professional, completely confident in their approach. Irene went to her quarters and sat on her bunk, staring at her calculations. The numbers didn't lie. Davies's approach would cause structural failure. Maybe not immediately, maybe not even during the breach itself, but the damage would cascade through the already compromised building. Those civilians might survive the initial breach, only to die when the upper floors collapsed minutes later. She thought about her father, about the lessons he'd taught her in those Austrian mountain mines. Numbers don't care about your rank or your reputation, he'd said. Physics doesn't negotiate. When you know something will fail, you have a responsibility to speak up even if nobody wants to listen. But she had spoken up. She'd been dismissed, relegated to support duty, told to trust the experience of people who couldn't see what she could see in the structural mathematics. Irene looked at her personal gear, already packed for the support convoy. Hidden in her demo bag were her precision charges, smaller, shaped differently from the standard military explosives, designed for surgical breaching. Nobody knew she carried them. Nobody had ever asked about her personal equipment beyond the standard checklist. The convoy would leave in 2 hours. She had that long to decide whether to accept her role as a bystander or to prepare for the possibility that everything would go wrong exactly as her calculations predicted. Her hands were shaking as she pulled out her demo bag and began checking her precision charges one more time. The convoy rolled out of Camp Sentinel at 1400 hours. A line of armored vehicles carrying engineers, security personnel, and medical support toward Pristina. Irene rode in the support vehicle surrounded by backup, equipment, and spare explosives. The landscape rolled past, dry hills dotted with villages, roads marked by the scars of recent conflict. The mission briefing had been clear. Get in, breach the wall, extract the civilians, get out. 2 hours from arrival to departure. The fragile ceasefire would hold that long, but not longer. Both sides of the conflict had been explicit about resuming hostilities once the humanitarian window closed. Irene spent the journey reviewing her calculations one more time, though she'd long since memorized every detail. The building's structural weaknesses were obvious to her now. She'd studied the plans so thoroughly that she could visualize the internal framework, see where the damage had compromised the load distribution, understand exactly how the compression waves from a standard breach would propagate through the foundation. "You're pretty focused back there, Hill," called out Corporal Wright, the support vehicle's driver. "Worried about the mission?" "Just reviewing procedures," Irene replied, closing her notebook. "Davies knows his stuff," Wright said confidently. "He's done more urban breaches than anyone in the battalion. Those civilians will be out in under an hour. Mark my words." Irene didn't respond. She hoped Wright was right, hoped that her calculations were somehow wrong, that Davies's experience would prove more reliable than her theoretical knowledge. But the numbers kept running through her mind, and they always reached the same conclusion. The convoy arrived at the staging area 3 blocks from the target building at 15:20 hours. The neighborhood was eerily quiet, evacuated under the terms of the ceasefire. Both sides of the conflict had pulled back to predetermined positions, creating a humanitarian corridor that felt more like a trap waiting to close. Major Henderson established the command post in a reinforced building with clear sight lines to the target. Irene helped unload the support equipment while Davies's breach team conducted their final approach reconnaissance. Through her binoculars, she could see the target building clearly now. 3 stories of Soviet-era concrete construction, visibly damaged on the upper floors with the infamous basement wall blocking the only safe entrance. "Team 1 in position," Davies's voice crackled over the radio. "Beginning breach prep. Estimate 20 minutes to ready." Irene watched through the binoculars as the breach team approached the wall. Even from 3 blocks away, she could see their placement pattern. Exactly as Davies had planned. In the tactical room, heavy charges in a diamond configuration, designed to overwhelm the concrete through sheer explosive force. Her stomach tightened. She could see the building's eastern wall from this angle, see the visible cracks that indicated compromised structural integrity. When those charges detonated, the compression waves would travel through the foundation and amplify through those existing fractures. "Major Henderson, sir," Irene said quietly, approaching the command position. "Yes, Hill?" "Sir, I request permission to position closer to the target. If there are any complications with the breach, I can provide immediate technical support." Henderson considered this, then nodded. "Stay behind the security perimeter. And Hill, this is observation only. Davies is running the breach. Understood?" "Understood, sir." Irene grabbed her demo bag, heavier than standard issue, weighted with her precision charges, and moved toward the forward position. The security team had established a perimeter 2 blocks from the target, close enough to respond to threats but far enough to avoid the blast zone. She found a position behind a concrete barrier with clear view of the breach site. Through her binoculars, she watched Davies and Kowalski making their final placement adjustments. The charges were set exactly as she'd feared. Heavy, positioned for maximum force with no consideration for the structural stress patterns she'd identified. "Charges set," Davies reported over the radio. "Preparing for detonation in 5 minutes. All personnel, clear the blast zone." The breach team withdrew to safe distance. Irene checked her watch. 15:47 hours, 73 minutes since arrival, well within the 2-hour window. If everything went according to plan, the civilians would be evacuated within 45 minutes, leaving comfortable time to clear the area before the ceasefire expired. But everything wasn't going to go according to plan. "All units, stand by for breach," Henderson's voice announced over the radio. 3, 2, 1, execute. The explosion was massive. A thunderclap of sound and pressure that made even the distant observation post shake. Dust and debris erupted from the basement wall, obscuring the target building in a grey cloud. Standard military breach, textbook execution, exactly what Davies's experience had called for. Irene watched through the settling dust, her heart pounding. For a moment, it seemed like it might work. The basement wall had clearly been breached. She could see the opening even through the debris cloud. The breach team was already moving forward to begin civilian extraction. Then she saw it. A crack appeared on the building's eastern wall, starting at ground level and racing upward like lightning. It wasn't the crack itself that terrified her. It was the pattern. The fracture was following exactly the stress lines her calculations had predicted, spreading through the compromised structure with geometric precision. "Davies, abort!" Irene shouted into her radio before thinking. "The eastern wall is failing. You need to evacuate now." "Hill, get off this channel," came Davies's irritated response. "The breach is clean. We're proceeding with extraction." But Irene was already moving. Irene ran toward the target building, her demo bag bouncing against her back. Behind her, she heard shouts from the security EC. Perimeter. Orders to fall back. Questions about what she was doing. She ignored them all, her focus locked on the spreading crack in the eastern wall. The breach team had entered the basement, unaware of the catastrophic structural failure developing above them. Through the dust, Irene could see more cracks appearing. Not dramatic collapses, but subtle fractures that spoke of imminent disaster. The building was failing from the inside out, the compression waves from the breach having triggered exactly the cascade effect her calculations had predicted. "Hill, return to position immediately," Henderson's voice barked over the radio. "That's a direct order." Irene switched off her radio and kept running. She'd face the consequences later. Right now, 12 civilians and a breach team were about to be buried under 3 floors of Soviet concrete. She reached the basement entrance at a dead sprint, her lungs burning. Inside, she could hear Davies's team coordinating with the trapped civilians, calm professional voices organizing an orderly evacuation through the newly created breach. "Davies," Irene shouted, dropping her demo bag. "The building's failing. You need to evacuate everyone now." Davies emerged from the basement, his face darkened with anger. "Hill, what the hell are you doing here? I told you." A deep groan cut him off, the sound of stressed concrete and bending rebar. Both engineers looked up to see dust falling from the basement ceiling as the structure above shifted minutely. It was the sound Irene had heard in her father's mining operations, the warning sign that miners learned to recognize and fear. "The upper floors are coming down," Irene said, her voice urgent but controlled. "Your breach created sympathetic failures in the eastern load-bearing walls. We have maybe 10 minutes before catastrophic collapse." Davies stared at her, and she could see the calculation happening behind his eyes, weighing his pride against the evidence of his own ears as another groan echoed through the building's structure. "How do you know we have 10 minutes?" he asked. "Because I've been studying this building for 3 weeks, Irene replied. "The failure pattern is following predictable stress lines. But Davies, there's another problem. Your breach damaged the basement's ceiling support. If we try to evacuate everyone through that opening, the vibration from foot traffic could accelerate the collapse." Kowalski appeared at the basement entrance, his expression tense. "Sir, the civilians say there's another wall blocking a secondary exit on the north side of the basement. If we could breach that, it would lead to an exterior stairwell that's structurally independent from the main building." Davies looked between Irene and Kowalski, his jaw tight. "How thick is the secondary wall?" 18 inches, non-reinforced brick according to the structural plans, Irene answered immediately. "But it's load-bearing for the north side internal wall." "Structure. A standard breach would bring down the entire north section." "Can you breach it without bringing down the building?" Davies asked, the question clearly costing him something. Irene met his eyes. "Yes, but I need to do it my way. Precision charges, calculated placement, minimal force. It'll take me 7 minutes to set up." Another groan. From the structure above, dust continued to fall, and through the basement entrance, they could now see visible deflection in the ceiling joists. The building was actively failing around them. Davies made his decision. "Do it. Kowalski, help her with whatever she needs. I'll keep the civilians calm and ready to move the second that wall comes down." Irene was already moving. Pulling her precision charges from her demo bag, she entered the basement to find 12 terrified civilians huddled in the far corner. 4 children clinging to their parents, elderly couples holding hands, young adults with fear-wide eyes. They'd survived being trapped between hostile forces, only to face death from a rescue operation gone wrong. "It's going to be okay," Irene told them in their language, her Austrian German close enough to the local Serbian to be understood. "We're getting you out. Just stay calm and stay together." The secondary wall was exactly where the structural plans had indicated. Brick construction, older than the rest of the building, load-bearing but not reinforced. Irene ran her hands over the surface, feeling for mortar consistency, identifying the weakest points in the construction. "What do you need?" Kowalski asked, his earlier skepticism replaced by focused professionalism. "Hold this." Irene handed him a charge. "When I tell you, place it exactly where I point. Exact placement is critical. We're targeting mortar joints, not brick faces." She pulled out her notebook, comparing the actual wall to her theoretical calculations. The numbers aligned perfectly. She knew where this wall would fail if properly motivated, knew how to create a breach without sending compression waves through the surrounding structure. "First charge here." She pointed to a spot 3 feet up, where 2 different brick layers met at a slightly offset joint. "Angle it 15 degrees toward the exterior wall." Kowalski placed the charge with surprising delicacy for such a large man. "Like this? Perfect. Second charge here." She indicated another point, this one near the wall's base, where the foundation met the brick construction. They worked rapidly, Irene calling out positions, and Kowalski following her instructions, without question. Davies watched from the main breach, coordinating with Henderson over the radio while keeping one eye on the increasingly unstable ceiling. 5 minutes, Davies called. "How much longer, Hill?" 2 more charges, Irene replied, her hands steady despite the adrenaline flooding her system. This was it. Everything she'd studied, everything she'd prepared for, all coming down to whether her calculations held true in real-world conditions. The 4th charge went in place. Then the 5th. Unlike the diamond pattern Davies had used, Irene's charges formed an asymmetrical pattern that looked almost random to the untrained eye. But she could see the geometry of it, could visualize how the blast waves would interact with the brick's natural stress points. "Ready?" she announced, backing away from the wall. Everyone moved to the far corner. Children in the center, adults around them. "When the wall comes down, we go out fast, but in order. No pushing, no panic." She looked at Davies. "Sir, you need to take your team out through the primary breach now before I detonate. This building's going to come down the second we're clear." "We're not leaving until the civilians are safe," Davies said flatly. "Lieutenant, that's an order, Hill. Blow the wall. We all leave together or not at all." Irene positioned herself at the detonator, her hands surprisingly steady for someone about to bet 12 civilian lives on her theoretical calculations. Around her, the basement had fallen eerily quiet, except for the continuous groaning of stressed concrete above them. She could see Davies's breach team positioned to guide the civilians through the new opening once it appeared. Kowalski stood ready with emergency lighting. The civilians huddled together, the children's faces pressed against their parents' shoulders. Everyone waited for her to prove that precision could accomplish what power couldn't. "Charges armed," Irene announced, her voice carrying the same calm authority her father had taught her in the Austrian mines. "Detonating in 3, 2, 1. She pressed the trigger. The explosion was sharp and focused, nothing like the thunderous blast of Davies's breach. It sounded almost delicate, like 5 precisely timed firecrackers instead of a military demolition. For a heartbeat, nothing seemed to happen, and Irene felt her stomach drop as she imagined her calculations failing. The wall standing intact, her theories proven worthless when lives depended on them. Then the wall moved. It didn't explode or shatter. It folded, the mortar joints failing in exact sequence as her shaped charges created stress waves that traveled along the brick layers. The wall collapsed inward in a controlled pattern, breaking into manageable sections that fell away from the exit rather than blocking it. 90 seconds after detonation, where there had been a solid brick wall, there was now a perfect opening, 4 feet wide, 7 feet tall, with clean edges and minimal debris field. The structural loads that the wall had been supporting redistributed through the remaining framework, exactly as Irene's calculations had predicted, causing no additional stress to the failing building above. "Go!" Davies shouted, and the evacuation began. The civilians moved quickly but without panic, shepherded by the breach team through Irene's opening and up the exterior stairwell. Beyond, the children went first, carried by soldiers who moved with urgent efficiency. Then the elderly, supported on either side. The younger adults followed, dancing back fearfully at the groaning structure they were leaving behind. Irene stayed at the detonator position, counting heads, 1, 2, 3, all 12 civilians through. Then Kowalski, then the rest of Davies's team. Finally Davies himself, who paused at the breach opening. "Hill, move!" But Irene was staring up at the basement ceiling, watching a crack that had just appeared in the reinforced concrete. The building's failure was accelerating, moving faster than her calculations had predicted. The primary breach point, Davies's explosive entry, had weakened the structure more severely than she'd accounted for. "The main breach is unstable," she called to Davies. "If we leave through there, the vibrations could trigger immediate collapse. We have to use the secondary exit." "Then stop analyzing and move." Davies grabbed her arm, physically pulling her toward the opening she'd created. They ran together through the breach, Irene's smaller strides barely keeping pace with Davies's longer legs. Behind them, the groaning of overstressed concrete grew louder, more ominous. They hit the exterior stairwell at a sprint, taking the steps 2 at a time, emerging into the sunlight just as a deep, grinding roar filled the air. The building collapsed. Not all at once, but in stages, the eastern wall folding inward first, exactly along the stress lines Irene had predicted. Then the upper floors pancaking down through the weakened structure. Finally, the basement ceiling, dropping into the space where 12 civilians and a breach team had been standing just minutes before. The collapse took 15 seconds, from start to finish. When the dust began to settle, the 3-story building had been reduced to a 2-story pile of rubble. The basement, where the civilians had been trapped, was completely buried under tons of concrete and rebar. Irene stood 50 feet away, watching the settling debris, her mind automatically calculating the forces involved in the collapse. If they'd tried to evacuate through Davies's primary breach, if they'd spent even 30 more seconds in that basement, everyone would be dead. "Hill." Davies's voice was quiet, almost stunned. "How did you know?" "The numbers," Irene replied, still watching the rubble. "The stress patterns, the failure propagation rates. It was all predictable if you understood the mathematics." Around them, the security team was securing the perimeter while medics checked the evacuated civilians. All 12 were safe, shaken, but unharmed. The breach team was intact. Against every probability, the mission had succeeded. Henderson approached, his expression mixing relief with anger. "Hill, you disobeyed a direct order when you left the observation post." "Yes, sir, I did." "You also apparently saved everyone's life." Henderson looked between her and Davies. "Someone want to tell me what happened in there?" Davies stepped forward. "Sir," Specialist Hill identified a catastrophic structural failure that my breach had triggered. She conducted a secondary breach using precision demolitions that allowed safe civilian evacuation. Without her intervention and expertise, we'd be looking at multiple casualties right now. It was the closest thing to an apology Irene had ever heard from Davies, and the public acknowledgement seemed to cost him significant pride. But he met Henderson's eyes steadily, not trying to minimize his own miscalculation or inflate his role in the successful evacuation. Henderson looked at Irene with new assessment. 90 seconds. That's what the team is saying. You breached that wall in 90 seconds from detonation to safe passage. Yes, sir. Precision charges placed at calculated stress points. It's more efficient than standard approaches when structural preservation matters. Apparently so. Henderson paused, then added, "We'll discuss your insubordination later, Hill. Right now, get those civilians loaded for medical evaluation. We're pulling out in 20 minutes, before this ceasefire evaporates." As Henderson walked away to coordinate the extraction, Irene found herself standing next to Kowalski, both of them watching the rubble of the collapsed building. "Sparkler," Kowalski said quietly. Irene tensed, waiting for the inevitable mockery. "I get it now," he continued. "The nickname. Your charges don't sparkle because they're weak. They sparkle because they're precise. Like a surgical laser instead of a sledgehammer." Irene looked at him, surprised. "That was the most impressive breach I've ever witnessed," Kowalski said. "And I've been doing this for 8 years. You saved all of us today." The convoy rolled back into Camp Sentinel just after midnight, exhausted personnel moving through the darkness with the quiet efficiency of soldiers who'd survived something significant. Irene helped unload equipment in silence, her hands performing familiar tasks while her mind replayed the mission on an endless loop. The building collapsing, the civilian safe, Davies's acknowledgement, Kowalski's unexpected respect, and underneath it all, the knowledge that she'd disobeyed direct orders, broken protocol, and inserted herself into an operation where she hadn't been assigned. "Hill, Major Henderson wants to see you, 0800 hours tomorrow," Sergeant Michaels informed her as she secured the last of the demo equipment. "His office. Don't be late." Irene nodded, expecting this. Military discipline didn't take holidays just because you'd saved lives. Insubordination was insubordination, regardless of outcome. She'd known the consequences when she'd run toward that building, had accepted them as the price of doing what she knew was right. In her quarters, she finally allowed herself to feel the exhaustion. Her hands were shaking now, adrenaline crash hitting hours after the fact. She'd been running on pure focus during the mission, every ounce of concentration devoted to calculations and execution. Now, in the quiet darkness, the reality of what could have gone wrong crashed over her. If her calculations had been off by even a degree, if the brick mortar had been stronger than anticipated, if the blast waves had propagated differently than predicted, 12 civilians and an entire breach team would be dead. The weight of that responsibility settled on her chest like a physical burden. But they weren't dead. They were safe, extracted, on their way to medical facilities and eventual return to their families. Her calculations had held true. Precision had proven superior to power, exactly as her father had always taught her. She pulled out her notebook, intending to document the mission for future reference, but found herself staring at a blank page. How did you quantify what had happened today? The technical details were straightforward: charge placement, detonation timing, structural failure patterns. But there was something more, something that didn't fit into equations and diagrams. For the first time since arriving at Camp Sentinel, she'd been seen. Not as Sparkler, not as the too small woman playing at engineering, but as a combat engineer whose skills had proved invaluable when they mattered most. Sleep came fitfully, punctuated by dreams of collapsing buildings and ticking countdown timers. When her alarm sounded at 06:30, Irene felt like she'd barely closed her eyes. She dressed carefully in her cleanest uniform, prepared her response to whatever disciplinary action Henderson planned to impose. The walk to Henderson's office felt longer than usual. Other soldiers passed her in the corridors, and Irene noticed something different in their glances. Not mockery or dismissal, but curiosity, mixed with something that might have been respect. Word had clearly spread about the Pristina mission. She knocked on Henderson's door at exactly 800 hours. "Enter." Henderson sat behind his desk, but he wasn't alone. Colonel Reeves from Division Headquarters occupied one of the guest chairs, his uniform decorated with enough ribbons to indicate serious combat experience. Lieutenant Davies stood near the window, his expression unreadable. Irene came to attention, her stomach tight with apprehension. This was more than a routine disciplinary meeting. The presence of Division Command suggested serious consequences for her unauthorized actions. "At ease, Hill," Henderson said, gesturing to an empty chair. "Have a seat. We need to discuss yesterday's mission." Irene sat, keeping her back straight and her hands folded in her lap. Whatever came next, she'd face it with the same calm she'd brought to that basement breach. "Specialist Hill," Colonel Reeves began, his voice carrying the weight of authority earned through decades of service. "I've read Lieutenant Davies's after-action report. I've also reviewed your service record and spoken with several members of the breach team. What I'm hearing paints an interesting picture." Irene waited, not sure if a response was expected. "You disobeyed a direct order during a combat operation," Reeves continued. "You left your assigned position, entered an active mission zone without authorization, and took command of a breach operation that wasn't your responsibility. Is that accurate?" "Yes, sir," Irene replied quietly. "That's accurate. Under normal circumstances, those actions would result in significant disciplinary measures, possibly a court-martial." Reeves paused, studying her. "However, these weren't normal circumstances, were they?" Davies spoke up from his position by the window. "Sir, if I may, Specialist Hill identified a catastrophic structural failure that I'd missed in my planning. Her intervention prevented what would have been multiple casualties, both civilian and military." It was strange hearing Davies defend her. This man who'd dismissed her methods for months, but his voice carried conviction, no trace of resentment or forced obligation. "I'm aware of that, Lieutenant," Reeves said, "which is why we're having this conversation instead of a court-martial proceeding. Hill, I want you to explain something to me. How did you know that building was going to collapse?" Irene chose her words carefully. "Sir, I'd studied the building's structural plans extensively. When I saw the charge placement pattern Lieutenant Davies was using, I calculated that the compression waves would interact with existing damage in specific ways. The building's eastern wall was already compromised. The breach would amplify those weaknesses." "You calculated all of that in advance?" Reeves asked. "Yes, sir. I'd been running scenarios for weeks, analyzing every building in the operational area. It's part of my preparation methodology." Reeves exchanged glances with Henderson. "Preparation that nobody asked you to conduct?" "No, sir. But being ready for scenarios others haven't anticipated is how I approach my duties." "Your duties are logistics support," Reeves pointed out, "not tactical breach planning." "My duties are to serve my fellow soldiers to the best of my abilities, sir," Irene replied, then added quietly, "Even when those soldiers don't think they need me." The silence that followed Irene's statement stretched uncomfortably. She realized she might have overstepped, let her frustration bleed through the professional facade she'd maintained for months. But the words were out now, hanging in the air like unexploded ordnance. Colonel Reeves leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful rather than angry. "Elaborate on that, Hill. What do you mean by soldiers who don't think they need you?" Irene hesitated, aware that Davies was listening, that Henderson was present, that her next words could define her entire military career. But after yesterday, after saving those lives while everyone watched, she found she was tired of careful diplomacy. "Sir, I've been with this battalion for 6 months. In that time, I've consistently demonstrated technical proficiency that meets or exceeds every standard. I've developed specialized skills in precision demolitions that could provide tactical advantages in urban environments. But I'm consistently assigned to logistics support, while less experienced engineers get mission assignments." "Why do you think that is?" Reeves asked, his tone neutral. "Because I don't fit their expectations of what a combat engineer should be," Irene answered honestly. "I'm small, I'm female, and my methods prioritize precision over power. That makes me easy to dismiss, even when the results prove my approach works." Davies shifted uncomfortably by the window but didn't interrupt. "You believe you've been discriminated against?" Henderson asked carefully. "I believe I've been underestimated, sir," Irene corrected. "There's a difference. Nobody has been overtly hostile, they just don't see me, don't consider me when planning real operations. I'm Sparkler, the engineer who's technically good but not combat ready." "Yet yesterday you proved yourself combat ready," Reeves observed. "Yesterday I did what any competent engineer would do when they saw lives in danger," Irene replied. "The fact that it surprised everyone says more about their expectations than my capabilities." Reeves picked up a folder from Henderson's desk, flipping through what appeared to be personnel reports. "Your training scores are exceptional. Top of your class in demolitions theory, advanced certifications in structural engineering, specialized training in precision breaching techniques. Why didn't this translate to field assignments? Henderson spoke up, his voice slightly defensive. Sir, we assigned personnel based on operational needs and experience levels. Hill's technical skills were valuable in logistics support, ensuring our demo teams had proper equipment. In other words, you put your best technical mind in an inventory role, Reeves said flatly, while sending less qualified engineers into situations where technical expertise could mean the difference between success and catastrophic failure. The implicit criticism hung heavy in the air. Henderson's face reddened slightly, but he didn't argue the point. Lieutenant Davies, Reeves turned his attention to the breach team leader. You've worked with Hill for 6 months. What's your honest assessment of her capabilities? Davies moved from the window, his expression troubled. Sir? Until yesterday, I would have said Hill was technically brilliant but untested in real combat conditions. I believed her methods were too slow, too theoretical for field operations. I was wrong. The admission clearly cost him something. Her breach yesterday was faster, cleaner, and more effective than any standard approach could have achieved, Davies continued. She accomplished in 90 seconds what might have taken my team 5 minutes with conventional methods. More importantly, she understood structural engineering principles that I'd overlooked despite 8 years of experience. So, why wasn't she on your breach team to begin with? Reeves asked. Davies met the colonel's gaze steadily. Because I made assumptions based on her appearance and approach rather than her demonstrated competence. I judged her by how she looked, instead of what she could do. That's on me, sir. Irene stared at Davies, stunned by his candor. This wasn't just an acknowledgement of her skills, it was a public admission of his own prejudice. At least you're honest about it, Reeves said. He turned back to Irene. Hill, here's the situation. Your unauthorized actions yesterday violated protocol. However, those actions also prevented casualties and demonstrated capabilities that this battalion has been underutilizing. That puts me in an interesting position. Irene waited, her heart pounding. I could discipline you for insubordination, Reeves continued, or I could recognize that sometimes the right action requires breaking the rules. The question is, if I choose the latter, can you operate within the chain of command going forward? Can you trust your superiors to listen when you raise concerns? The question was directed at her, but Irene noticed Reeves's gaze flickering toward Henderson and Davies. The real question wasn't about her willingness to follow orders. It was about whether the command structure would give her reason to trust it. Sir, I've always wanted to work within the system, Irene said carefully. But the system has to work with me too. If my expertise is valued only after I prove it by breaking protocol, that's not a sustainable approach. Agreed, Reeves said. Which brings me to why I'm here. Division has been developing a specialized urban warfare unit. Engineers trained specifically for precision operations in complex structural environments. The kind of scenarios where standard breaching methods create unacceptable collateral damage risks. Irene's attention sharpened. We need engineers who can think beyond conventional approaches, Reeves continued, who understand that sometimes the best solution isn't the biggest explosion. Based on your performance yesterday and your service record, I'm offering you a position on that unit, effective immediately. The words took a moment to process. Not punishment, not dismissal. A promotion to exactly the kind of specialized role she'd been preparing herself for without knowing it existed. Sir, Yes, absolutely yes. There are conditions, Reeves warned. You'll undergo intensive training in advanced demolitions, structural engineering, and tactical operations. You'll be held to the highest standards because your methods will be unconventional. And you'll need to learn to work within command structure even when you disagree with decisions. I understand, sir. One more thing, Reeves added. We need someone to help develop training protocols for this new unit, someone who understands both the technical theory and the practical application of precision demolitions. Lieutenant Davies has agreed to serve as tactical operations lead. We need a technical operations lead. Interested? Irene looked at Davies, who nodded slightly. The man who'd dismissed her for months was now willing to work beside her as an equal. The magnitude of that shift was almost overwhelming. "Yes, sir," she managed, very interested. The next 3 months transformed Irene's military career in ways she'd never imagined possible. The Specialized Urban Warfare Unit, officially designated the Precision Engineering Task Force, assembled at a training facility outside Stuttgart, bringing together combat engineers from across the European theater. Irene arrived expecting to be the outsider once again, the unconventional specialist who'd need to prove herself to skeptical colleagues. Instead, she found herself among engineers who'd been selected specifically because they thought differently, who'd developed their own alternative approaches to standard demolitions doctrine. "You're the Pristina breach engineer," said a tall Norwegian named Eriksson, when Irene introduced herself at the first team meeting. "I read the after-action report, 90-second breach on a compromised structure. That's textbook precision work." "There's no textbook for what she did," added a French engineer named Dubois. "That's the point. We're here to write the new textbook." Lieutenant Davies ran the tactical training with the same aggressive competence he'd brought to the 3rd Battalion. But now his approach incorporated lessons learned from Pristina. Standard breaching had its place, he acknowledged, but so did precision work. The key was knowing which approach fit which scenario. Irene's role as technical operations lead meant designing training protocols that would teach the conventional engineers to think unconventionally. It was challenging work translating her intuitive understanding of structural mechanics into lessons that others could learn and apply. "Walk me through your assessment process," Davies asked during a planning session. They were designing a training scenario based on a multi-story apartment building. "How do you decide where to place charges?" Irene pulled out her notebook, now an official document rather than a personal obsession. "First, I identify the load-bearing elements and how they distribute stress. Then I look for existing weaknesses, cracks, material degradation, construction flaws. Finally, I calculate how blast waves will propagate through the structure and where they'll amplify or cancel out." "How long does that take?" asked Kowalski, who had requested transfer to the new unit specifically to work with Irene. "For a simple structure, maybe 10 minutes. For something complex like the Pristina building, I spent weeks on the analysis." "We don't always have weeks," Davies pointed out, but his tone was curious rather than dismissive. "No, but we can build a database of common building types and pre-calculate optimal breach patterns," Irene suggested. "If you know you're going into Soviet-era construction, you start with templates developed for that architecture, then adjust for specific conditions." The training program they developed emphasized what Irene had always practiced: preparation through study. Combat engineers learned to recognize building types by sight, to estimate structural conditions from visual inspection, to carry mental templates for dozens of common scenarios. But they also learned something Irene had to teach herself: confidence in unconventional methods. Many of the engineers struggled with using smaller charges, trusting precision over power. They'd been trained to err on the side of too much explosive rather than too little, and unlearning that instinct took time. "It feels wrong," Eriksson admitted after his first precision breach exercise. "Like I'm not hitting hard enough." "Because you're measuring impact by explosion size rather than result," Irene explained. "Look at your breach. Clean edges, minimal debris, no structural damage to surrounding walls. You accomplish the mission objective with 60% less explosives than a standard approach would use." "But what if I'd calculated wrong? What if the wall hadn't come down?" "Then you'd adjust and try again," Irene said. "But you didn't calculate wrong. You studied the structure, identified the weak points, placed your charges precisely. Trust the mathematics." It was strange, teaching confidence to engineers who'd always projected certainty. They were learning that precision required a different kind of courage than overwhelming force, the courage to trust your calculations over your instincts, to believe that smaller could be better. 3 months into the training program, Colonel Reeves visited to assess the unit's progress. The demonstration he requested was challenging: breach a reinforced concrete wall that formed part of a mock building's foundation without damaging the structure above or the adjacent walls. Davies assigned the task to Irene. She approached it like any other mission, studying the mock building's construction, mapping stress points, calculating optimal charge placement. The assembled officers watched as she worked at her movements, efficient and precise. The charges she placed looked almost delicate compared to standard military explosives. Those are custom-shaped charges, she explained to Reeves, designed to direct blast energy along specific vectors. They'll create shear stress at the molecular level rather than compression waves that propagate through the structure. In layman's terms, Reeves asked, and the wall will fail exactly where I want it to, leaving everything else intact. She stepped back to the detonator, conscious of multiple eyes, watching, waiting to see if her methods would scale to teaching others. This wasn't just about proving her own competence anymore. It was about validating an entire training philosophy. Detonating in 3, 2, 1. The explosion was sharp and focused, familiar now to the engineers who'd spent months learning precision techniques. The wall shifted, cracked along calculated failure lines, and collapsed inward in controlled segments. 90 seconds later, there was a perfect breach, and the structure above remained completely stable. Reeves walked through the breach, examining the clean edges and minimal debris field. Impressive, but the real question is whether you can teach this to others reliably. She already has, sir, Davies said. He gestured to Erickson, Dubois, and 3 other engineers. Every member of this unit can now perform precision breaches to within 10% of Hill's efficiency. We've documented protocols for 15 common building types and developed field assessment techniques that allow engineers to make calculations under combat pressure. Show me, Reeves ordered. For the next 2 hours, the Precision Engineering Task Force demonstrated their capabilities. Engineer after engineer performed breaches that would have been considered impossible months earlier. Minimal explosives, maximum control, 0 collateral damage. The training protocols Irene had developed were working. As the demonstration concluded, Reeves pulled Irene aside. I've received a request from Operational Command. There's a situation developing in urban Sarajevo, hostage scenario in a reinforced building with civilian population in adjacent structures. They need a precision breach team. Interested? Irene felt her pulse quicken. This was what all the training had been building toward, taking precision demolitions from theory to real-world operations. Absolutely, sir. Good, because they specifically requested you as team lead. Seems your reputation has spread beyond this unit. You deploy in 48 hours. The briefing room in Sarajevo was cramped and hot, filled with personnel from multiple military and civilian agencies. Irene stood at the front with Davies, facing a map that showed a 4-story commercial building in the city's downtown district. Red markers indicated hostile positions. Blue markers showed civilian locations, and in the center, a green marker represented 12 hostages being held by an armed group on the building's 2nd floor. The situation is delicate, explained Commander Peterson, the operation's overall lead. The hostage-takers have threatened to execute captives if we attempt a forced entry through conventional means. They're monitoring all standard access points, doors, windows, ground floor entrances. Which is where your team comes in, added the local police commander. We need an entry point they're not watching, something unexpected. Irene studied the building's architectural plans, spread across the table. It was Yugoslav-era construction, similar to structures she'd analyzed during her time in Kosovo, but with unique features that complicated any breach plan. The challenge is the building's age and condition, she said, pointing to stress indicators on the structural drawings. This construction was designed for moderate seismic activity, which means the walls are reinforced, but the floor-to-ceiling connections are the weak points. A standard breach anywhere but could trigger floor collapse. What about from above? Davies suggested. Roof access followed by a vertical breach downward to the 2nd floor. Too slow and too visible, Peterson replied. The moment they hear activity out on the roof, they start executing hostages. We need simultaneous breach and entry. No warning, no time for the hostage-takers to react. Irene walked around the table, studying the building from different angles. The architectural plans showed something interesting. An old service tunnel that ran beneath the building, originally designed for utility access but long since abandoned. What about breaching upward? She asked him. Through the floor. The room fell silent as everyone processed the suggestion. Through the floor, Peterson repeated skeptically. That's, unconventional. The service tunnel runs directly beneath the room where hostages are being held. Irene traced the path on the map. If we access the tunnel, we can breach upward through the floor. The hostage-takers will be watching walls and doors, not expecting entry from below. Davies leaned over the plans, his tactical mind immediately seeing the possibilities. It could work. Complete surprise. Minimal warning time. But the technical challenge is significant. You'd need to breach reinforced concrete flooring without bringing down the ceiling above or alerting the hostage-takers before entry. Which is exactly what precision demolitions is designed for, Irene replied. She pulled out her tablet, already running calculations. The floor structure is 20 centimeters of reinforced concrete over steel joists. If we place shaped charges along the joist lines, we can create a breach opening without generating compression waves that would travel through the building structure. How long to set the charges? Peterson asked. In the tunnel, working in constrained space with minimal lighting. 40 minutes from access to ready for detonation. And the breach itself? 90 seconds from detonation to safe entry. The number had become almost iconic in Irene's work. 90 seconds, the time frame that had saved lives in Pristina and now defined her approach to precision breaching. It wasn't the fastest possible breach, but it was the fastest, safe breach, when precision mattered more than speed. Peterson consulted with the police commander in hushed tones, then turned back to Irene. If we approve this approach, you'd be working in a confined space directly beneath armed hostage-takers. If anything goes wrong, if the charges fail or if they detect your presence, you'd be trapped in that tunnel with no quick escape route. I understand the risk, sir, Irene replied calmly. This isn't a training exercise, Hill. This is 12 real hostages and real consequences if your calculations are off. My calculations won't be off, sir. Irene met his gaze, steadily. I've spent the last 3 months teaching other engineers how to do this work. I'm not asking them to trust methods I wouldn't trust myself. Davies spoke up. Sir, I'll accompany her in the tunnel. If there are complications, we handle them together. Peterson looked between them. The young Austrian engineer who'd revolutionized precision demolitions, and the experienced breach team leader who'd learned to trust unconventional methods. Whatever doubts he had, he set them aside. You have authorization, but understand, if this goes wrong, we won't have a backup plan. Your breach is our only shot at getting those hostages out alive. 6 hours later, Irene found herself crawling through a dark, cramped service tunnel that smelled of damp concrete and decades of decay. Davies moved behind her, both of them loaded with specialized equipment designed for exactly this kind of operation. Above them, 12 hostages waited in a room surrounded by armed men who had no idea what was coming. The tunnel was worse than the architectural plans had suggested, partially flooded, blocked in places by collapsed sections that required careful navigation. But Irene had studied these plans obsessively over the past 6 hours, had memorized every centimeter of the route. Position Alpha, she whispered into her radio, confirming they'd reached the point directly beneath the hostage room. Copy, came Peterson's response. You have green light to begin breach prep. Hostage rescue team is standing by. Irene positioned her lighting rig, illuminating the concrete ceiling above them. Through the layers of construction, she could hear faint sounds, voices, movement, the ambient noise of the room where 12 people waited to learn if they'd live or die. Starting structural assessment, she told Davies, pulling out her portable ultrasound device. The scanner revealed what the architectural plans had suggested: reinforced concrete with steel joists spaced at regular intervals, some degradation from water damage, but overall structural integrity was sound. She marked charge placement points with luminescent paint, working with the same careful precision she'd brought to that first training wall at Camp Sentinel months ago. Each mark represented hours of calculation, years of study, a lifetime of preparing for moments exactly like this. Charges ready, she whispered, 40 minutes later, exactly on schedule. Hostage rescue team in position, Peterson confirmed through her earpiece. On your mark, Hill. Irene's hand rested on the detonator, steady despite everything riding on the next 90 seconds. Above her, 12 strangers, trusted their lives to calculations they'd never seen, performed by an engineer they'd never met. She thought about her father in those Austrian mines, teaching her that precision mattered more than power. She thought about Davies dismissing her as sparkler while she quietly prepared for this exact moment. She thought about all the engineers who'd laughed at her demo skills until she showed them what 90 seconds of properly applied mathematics could accomplish. "Breaching in 3, 2, 1, she said calmly, and pressed the detonator. The explosion was precise and controlled. A sharp crack that echoed through the tunnel like a gunshot. Irene counted silently. 1 Mississippi, 2 Mississippi, as the shaped charges did their work above her. The ultrasound scanner had shown her exactly where the steel joists ran, and she'd placed her explosives to cut through concrete without compromising the structural supports. At 15 seconds, the first section of floor gave way, dropping into the tunnel in a controlled fall that Irene and Davies had anticipated. They pressed against the tunnel walls as concrete segments landed exactly where the calculations predicted, away from their position, creating a clear opening overhead. At 30 seconds, the breach hole was complete, a rectangular opening 2 meters by 1 meter, perfectly sized for rapid entry by the hostage rescue team waiting above. At 45 seconds, Irene heard the first sounds of chaos from the room above, shouts of confusion, scrambling movement, the hostage takers suddenly aware that something was catastrophically wrong with their defensive position. At 60 seconds, the first rescue team members dropped through the breach hole, their entry so fast and coordinated that the hostage takers barely had time to react. Flashbang grenades detonated, adding to the confusion Irene's breach had created. At 90 seconds, it was over. "All hostages secured," came the call through Irene's earpiece. "Hostile elements neutralized. Breach team, you are clear to extract." Irene sagged against the tunnel wall, her entire body trembling with released tension. Davies gripped her shoulder, his expression mixing relief and respect. 90 seconds, he said quietly. "Right on schedule." They extracted through the tunnel, emerging into the Sarajevo twilight to find the street blocked off and emergency vehicles surrounding the building. Medical personnel were already treating the hostages, 12 people ranging from teenagers to elderly, all alive, all safe, because a floor had opened beneath them at exactly the right moment. Commander Peterson approached as Irene stripped off her tactical gear. "Hill, that was the cleanest hostage rescue breach I've witnessed in 20 years of operations. The hostage takers never knew what hit them. By the time they understood there was a hole in their floor, the rescue team was already inside." "That was the idea, sir," Irene replied, her voice steadier than she felt. "Surprise through unconventional approach. You've proven your methods work in training and now in real operations," Peterson continued. "I'm recommending your team for immediate deployment status. There are 6 other situations in this theater that could benefit from precision breach capabilities." Over the next 3 months, the Precision Engineering Task Force conducted 17 operations across the Balkans. Each mission reinforced what Pristina had first demonstrated, that sometimes the best solution wasn't the biggest explosion, but the most carefully calculated one. Irene breached walls in contested urban zones, created entry points in buildings where standard methods would have caused civilian casualties, and trained local forces in precision techniques that would serve them long after the international troops withdrew. The young woman who'd been dismissed as sparkler had become one of the most requested engineers in the European theater. But success brought its own challenges. The more missions Irene completed, the more people wanted to use her team, and the requests started coming faster than they could be properly assessed. Precision work required preparation time, and commanders accustomed to rapid deployment sometimes struggled to understand why Irene needed hours or days to plan what they saw as straightforward breaches. "We can't be everything to everyone," Davies told her during a planning session at their temporary base in Zagreb. "You've built something remarkable here, but we need to be selective about which missions we take, quality over quantity." He was right, Irene knew. The temptation to prove herself on every possible mission was strong, but accepting operations without proper preparation, time would eventually lead to failure. Better to do fewer missions exceptionally well than many missions adequately. The decision point came during a briefing about a potential operation in Macedonia. A military commander wanted the Precision Engineering Task Force to conduct 3 simultaneous breaches in different locations, all within a 4-hour window. "It's not feasible," Irene told Colonel Reeves during the planning review. "Each breach requires minimum 2 hours of on-site assessment and preparation. We can't maintain our precision standards while working on compressed timelines across multiple locations." "The commander says it's urgent," Reeves replied. "Critical to operational success." "Then the commander needs to understand that precision engineering isn't instant," Irene said firmly. "We can do the mission right, or we can do it fast. We can't do both. If speed is more important than precision, they should use standard breach teams." It was a risk, potentially turning down a high-profile mission. But Irene had learned something over the past months. Her value came from maintaining standards, not from saying yes to every request. Reeves studied her for a long moment, then nodded. "You're right. I'll inform the commander that your team isn't available for this timeline. Better to preserve your capabilities for missions where they're truly needed." The decision proved wise. 2 weeks later, a request came through for exactly the kind of operation the Precision Engineering Task Force was designed for, a delicate situation requiring surgical precision rather than overwhelming force. And because Irene had protected her team's capacity by declining the Macedonia mission, they were ready. 18 months after that morning at Camp Sentinel, Irene stood in a lecture hall at the NATO Engineering School in Hohenfels, Germany. Before her sat 60 combat engineers from 12 different countries, all gathered to learn the precision demolitions techniques that had evolved from those early experiments with calculated stress points and minimal explosives. Demolitions engineering is fundamentally about understanding how materials fail, Irene told the assembled students, her accented English now carrying the authority of someone who'd proven their theories in the most demanding circumstances. Power alone doesn't give you control. Precision does. On the screen behind her, video footage played from various missions: the Pristina basement breach, the Sarajevo hostage rescue, a dozen other operations where 90 seconds of properly applied mathematics had accomplished what hours of standard approaches couldn't. "The key is preparation," she continued. "Study the structures you might encounter. Build mental templates for common building types. Learn to assess stress points by sight. Then, when the critical moment comes, you'll have the knowledge base to make accurate calculations under pressure." In the audience, she recognized several faces from her time at Camp Sentinel. Kowalski sat in the 3rd row, now an instructor himself, teaching others the techniques he'd learned working alongside Irene. Even Thompson was present, the engineer who'd once questioned whether someone her size could handle real demolitions work. After the lecture, as students clustered around with questions about specific scenarios, Lieutenant Colonel Davies approached with someone Irene didn't recognize, a young engineer, barely 20, who looked both nervous and determined. "Hill, this is Specialist Chen," Davies introduced them. "She just completed basic combat engineering school, top of her technical class. Her instructors say she has an exceptional aptitude for structural analysis, but that she's unconventional in her approaches." Irene smiled, recognizing the careful phrasing. "Unconventional how?" "She uses minimal charges and spends too much time on calculations," Davies said, and there was a glimmer of humor in his eyes. "Sound familiar?" Chen spoke up, her voice quiet but steady. "I read your published papers on precision demolitions, ma'am. Your work on stress point targeting revolutionized how I think about breaching operations. I was hoping... that is, if your team has openings." She trailed off, and Irene saw in this young engineer something of herself 18 months ago, someone with skills that didn't fit the expected mold, someone who'd probably faced dismissal and doubt, someone preparing for opportunities that others said would never come. "The Precision Engineering Task Force always has room for engineers who think differently," Irene said. "But I should warn you, the training is intensive. We'll push you harder than you've ever been pushed. We'll expect you to master both the mathematics and the practical application, and you'll need to prove yourself not just once but on every mission." I understand, ma'am, Chen replied. I'm ready for that. Looking at this eager young engineer, Irene thought about her own journey. From sparkler to team leader, from dismissed logistics specialist to sought-after expert. The path had required her proving herself repeatedly, had demanded persistence through doubt and dismissal, had meant preparing obsessively for moments that might never come. But those moments had come, and when they did, she'd been ready. Report to our training facility in Stuttgart next Monday, Irene told Chen. Bring your notebooks, your questions, and your unconventional ideas. We'll teach you how to turn 90 seconds into a lifetime of respect. As Chen left, practically glowing with excitement, Davies lingered beside Irene. You've come a long way from that training ground at Camp Sentinel, he observed. The engineer everyone underestimated. We all came a long way, Irene replied. You learned to value precision over power. Kowalski learned that size doesn't determine capability. The whole battalion learned that sometimes the best solution comes from the person nobody expected. What did you learn? Davies asked. Irene considered the question, thinking about collapsed buildings and calculated risks, about tunnel breaches and training protocols, about all the moments when she'd chosen to trust her mathematics over others' doubts. I learned that being underestimated is only a disadvantage if you accept their estimation, she said finally. When they laugh at your demo skills, you don't argue. You prepare, you study, you build your expertise in the quiet hours when nobody's watching. And then, when the critical moment comes, when there's a wall that needs breaching in 90 seconds, or lives will be lost, you show them exactly what those laughable skills can accomplish. Davies nodded slowly. 90 seconds. That's become your signature, you know. Engineers across the theater talk about pulling a hill, accomplishing the impossible in 90 seconds through perfect preparation. It's not about the 90 seconds, Irene said. It's about the years of preparation that make those 90 seconds possible. Anyone can learn to place charges. The question is whether you're willing to do the work that nobody sees, to develop the skills that nobody values, to be ready for the moment when everything depends on expertise that everyone dismissed. She looked around the lecture hall at the students still discussing precision techniques, at the next generation of combat engineers, learning that unconventional doesn't mean ineffective. They laughed at my demo skills, Irene said quietly, until I breached the wall in 90 seconds. Now they're teaching my methods at NATO engineering schools. That's not revenge. That's vindication. That's proof that the person everyone underestimates might be exactly the person who changes everything. Outside, the German sun was setting, casting long shadows across the training grounds. Somewhere out there, another young engineer was being dismissed as too small, too theoretical, too unconventional. Another sparkler was preparing for a moment that others insisted would never come. Irene hoped they were taking notes, studying structures, building the expertise that would let them turn 90 seconds into a lifetime of respect. Because the world needed engineers who understood that precision mattered more than power, that preparation trumped assumptions, and that sometimes the person everyone laughed at was the one who'd save them all. She smiled and headed toward the training grounds, where tomorrow's impossible breaches were waiting to become today's proven methods, one calculated explosion at a time. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.